All right, let's get started, if you will. The first two songs that I played today actually come from a large or a long performance piece that Laurie Anderson did on Moby Dick. And she performed it at the Brooklyn Academy of Music back in the day, and also, I think, at the Barbican. And these two come from the Barbican concerts, which were never officially released, but were broadcast on the BBC. So these tracks are, how shall we say, generally available or are available on the web if people are interested in them. She had mixed feelings, I think, about the way it turned out, and some of the material got reused in later couple of albums of hers. But it's actually, if you're interested in Moby Dick, it's actually an interesting thing to listen to in its entirety. It does have a certain kind of droning quality about it, perhaps, but I like these two pieces in particular. So our subject today actually is domination, and we will get to that. And I want you to understand, again, that in some sense Monday and today are two ways of thinking about a problem that we raised earlier on when we were talking about the Enlightenment, which is that the Enlightenment, out of which the U.S. nation springs, has a lot of ideals that we would approve of, I think, most of us. They are things like life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, or the ideas of toleration, freedom, equality, scientific progress, all those things that we associated with Franklin's view of the world. And on the other hand, we asked, is it true that, in fact, these ideals are separable from some of the other things that historically, at least, went along with the Enlightenment, right? Prominent among these would be slavery and racism and patriarchy and sexism, right? Are those just impurities within Enlightenment thought that in the fullness of time get worked out and pared away, and so that Enlightenment thought realizes its true potential? Or are they somehow connected? That you can't have freedom without the idea of domination. Freedom doesn't exist without the idea of oppression. And remember, I told you that the definition of freedom that most political scientists would say we take for granted in Western liberal culture, in which we all belong, is freedom from oppression, what's called a negative conception of freedom. Freedom as conceived as freedom from constraint, freedom as a set of rights that gives us a sphere of immunity from, you might say, the depredations and constraints and involvement, really, of others, right? We have certain things that are ours and they can't be taken away from us. Life, liberty, property. These things are supposed to be inherent in every individual. But what I suggested is that, in some sense, conceiving of freedom as freedom from restraint or freedom from constraint or freedom from oppression means you have got to have previously conceived of restraint, constraint, and oppression as something you'd want to be free from, right? The opposite view of this is that freedom is not, that's a very impoverished view of freedom, and that freedom is really only exists, you might say, in its exercise. So that instead of thinking of freedom as freedom from something or other, we need to think about freedom to do something or other, or freedom for something or other. And that's referred to by political theorists as the positive conception of liberty. Right? But for the most part, I think when we think about freedom in the West, we think about that former sense. Freedom from constraint. Freedom from oppression or domination. So if last time was about agency and thinking about the novel's dramatization of some of the problems of agency, you might say that this is in some sense continuous with it, but from the other side of the coin, thinking about the nature of domination and whether some of these other things that Ahab wants to pursue are inextricably tied to the idea of some people or some things being dominated. One of the things I want you to think about is the way in which what Ahab proposes on the quarterdeck, and last time we explored the ways in which the novel itself registers textually how disruptive Ahab's change in the ship's mission, or rather his revelation of what he conceives to be the true mission of the ship, how radically that disrupts their world, right? The novel itself breaks apart, has to go to drama, has to go outside itself to another genre. We have Ishmael almost fighting to regain control of his own narrative and forcing us to rethink several chapters. I, Ishmael, was one of that crew. I raised my voice as well. My oath was theirs. We all swore together. And you can see that the way in which what we have is a kind of textual representation of the phenomenology, we might call it, of the experience of being drawn into an ideological consensus. Ahab very carefully sets out that ideological consensus through this appeal to some instincts that they're familiar with. We might think of that as the money instinct, the doubloon, for example, the natural greed of the sailors, perhaps, or simply their desire to earn more than they expect to be promised, or that they were promised, changed into something else. From an economic discourse, we saw a slip into a kind of metaphysical discourse. And we suggested that, there are certain ways in which other thinkers in our course, for example, Emerson, would probably have approved of some of this, right? Measure a man by money only? No. Money's got to be, it can't be the only thing according to which we measure a man. Something impoverished about Starbucks' account of why they're there. Maybe there is something greater, more glorious in Ahab's account. Not just seeking money, but seeking something else. And what I want you to see is that there are a couple of things that are implicit in the way that Ahab reframes things on the quarterdeck. The first is that he rejects Starbuck's idea that anything could simply be by instinct. That's not acceptable. Because if it's by instinct, then the loss of his leg, his maiming, the loss, you might say, of his bodily integrity is meaningless. Doesn't mean anything. It just happened. It's an accident. Didn't mean anything. Nobody intended anything. Just happened. Accident of the fishery. For Ahab, that becomes unacceptable. It has to mean something. Now, again, you can think about this as, for anybody who's undergone any kind of loss or trauma, it's almost a kind of natural reflex. It's got to mean something, right? There was a reason that this happened to me, this terrible thing happened to me or my family, or that I lost this thing. It's got to mean something, right? We all want meaningfulness. Ahab simply takes that natural instinct and maybe takes it too far. It means not only not nothing, it means everything. And in a way, it becomes a set, you might say, a way of thinking about the affront to Ahab in some sense as an affront to humanity as a whole. Think about it this way. Who's at the top of the food chain? By divine fiat, if you believe the Bible, right? Man, Adam. Adam is given dominion over the earth, over all the beasts and things of the earth and the sea. And Adam is, in part of Genesis, actually names all these things, really takes control of the earth in that way. Right? So there's a sanction for this sort of thing. We eat everything else if we're at the top of the food chain. Other stuff is not supposed to eat us. So if your leg becomes lunch for a whale, there's something unnatural about that. In fact, you could say it's against the divine order of things. In that sense, you might say Ahab conceives himself maybe as a divine agent. He's going to reset things the way they're supposed to be. He's going to restore humanity back to the top of the food chain by destroying Moby Dick. Moby Dick's unnatural affront to the natural order of things. Be one way of thinking about it. But what if God sent the whale? Which is another thing that Ahab doesn't want to exclude. What if that whale is an agent? Maybe it's its own malign agent. Maybe it's the principal and the agent at the same time. Maybe it was the whale that thinks. The whale that is itself taking issue with human beings' right to go and have dominion over the earth and the sea. Or what if something else sent? What if God sent the whale? That would put Ahab at odds with God. He's willing to be at odds with God. Again, that's not entirely at odds with Emersonian precepts, right? You remember that moment in Self-Reliance when he's talking about trust yourself. Somebody says, well, what if your impulses come from below, right, from the devil? And Emerson says, I don't think so, but if that's where they come from, that's where they come from. I'm going to play them out. Maybe, in other words, what we're seeing in Ahab is the kind of Emersonian self writ large. Writ as a kind of epic figure that we know from literature. Writ as an example, you might say, of the energies of American manifest destiny, and therefore as an example of American national culture. Maybe one of the things the novel is doing is saying, what happens if we really put these Emersonian ideas into practice? What does it look like? What if the ship of state is being run by a mega Emersonian? What might happen then? That's one possibility that we should be thinking about. What I want you to see is that Ahab conceives of the stakes as being very large. It's not just some petty hunt for a whale. This is, in some sense, an idea of restoring balance to the world in an almost Old Testament way of retribution. And that's one of the things that I think is so disruptive that it gets registered in this way in the text. So that's what the crew has signed on for, this large symbolic mission that Ahab himself, not just literary critics, Ahab himself is making into something symbolic. Right? Now, one of the things we might say is that Ishmael tries to understand what's going on here. And I wanted to turn back to that place at the end of the chart. So this is on page 170. Right? He's used some of that same language of agent and principle. He's tried to do what Ahab has done, which is to appropriate this language of economy and make it suitable to philosophy and metaphysics and trying to understand what's going on within Ahab's psyche. And he uses it here. Let's take a look at actually, let's go back to 169. I just want to go over this one more time, right? Because we had to do it somewhat quickly. And again, another intertext. I'm not sure if it's not an actual intertext, but insofar as they are part of the same kind of web of discourse, you might say, that envelops all of U.S. literature and culture in the middle of the 19th century, we ought to be having Whitman's account of the soul and its relationship to the self, and the body and its relationship to the self in mind. Right? There's a funny moment you'll remember in Whitman's poem where he imagines the body and the soul in kind of literal congress with one another. And he doesn't, like an Emersonian might want to disparage the body. Right? He takes it a little far in his metaphor, perhaps, but there is a sense of, if you conceive of body and soul, again, if you want the union of body and soul, right? So imagine that scene where he asks the soul to loaf with him in the grass, and they have this kind of whatever you want to call it, orgasmic moment together. It also means conceiving of them being brought together means conceiving of them being apart. So even implicit in Whitman's understanding of union, there's the sense of a possibility of separateness. Look at the way in which union and separateness work here. Union in Whitman is a very good thing. So this is about 5 years later. Whitman's going to write this under the pressure of the Compromise of 1850. He's thinking about joining, adhesiveness, sexuality, procreation, creation, union, all as a kind of web of imagery. Look at the union that's being described here in this passage and see that one of the things that's happened is there's something unnatural about the union because something else has been brought in that doesn't belong there. For at such times, crazy Ahab, a scheming, unappeasedly steadfast hunter of the white whale, this Ahab that had gone to his hammock. So we might think of that as the conscious self, the self that the Enlightenment is interested in, right? The rationalizing, conscious, intending self. Goes to its hammock, was not the agent that so caused him to burst from it in horror again. Right? So somehow the body is bursting in horror in the middle of the night. And it's that rational self is not the agent, Ishmael says. There's something else. The latter, okay, so that latter we have to map back grammatically to agent. That latter was the eternal living principle or soul. And again, this is principle spelled differently. But I would like to say that there's a pun going on here between principle, as in, a precept, and principle in the sense of principle and agent. The latter was the eternal living principle or soul in him, and in sleep, being for the time dissociated from the characterizing mind, right? So in the rational Cartesian self, the soul and the mind are joined together, which at other times employed it for its outer vehicle or agent, which would seem to suggest that at other times the characterizing mind employs the soul for its outer vehicle or agent. It spontaneously sought to escape from the scorching contiguity of the frantic thing of which, for the time, it was no longer an integral. Right? And that's because this idea of revenge has somehow taken on a life of its own, usurped way more of Ahab's consciousness than it should. So we see. But as the mind does not exist unless leagued with the soul, therefore it must have been that. Again, he's speculating. He doesn't know. He's trying to figure it out. He has these principles of how body, soul, and mind must go together. Something's wrong, so he's trying to figure out what's gone wrong. As the mind does not exist unless leagued with the soul, therefore it must have been that in Ahab's case, yielding up all his thoughts and fancies to his one supreme purpose, that purpose by its own sheer inveteracy of will. So it's not his sheer inveteracy of will, it's the purpose itself. forced itself against gods and devils into a kind of self-assumed independent being of its own. Nay, could grimly live and burn, while the common vitality to which it was conjoined fled horror-stricken from the unbidden and unfathered birth. Right? So we're saying that the soul itself is fleeing away from this purpose. And therefore, at that moment, what seems like Ahab is a vacated thing. It's soulless. So one of the things I suggested to you is this is Ishmael's attempt to think about the psychology of revenge and what revenge does. How does it destroy the self? I mean, again, it's the kind of thing that Hawthorne was investigating in his portrayal of Chillingworth. And the funny thing about it is it makes Ahab into something like what Ahab conceives the whale to be, a kind of blank thing, right? A blankness in itself. Now, it's sometimes I look at this and I think it actually makes sense, and other times I think what it demonstrates is that it doesn't make sense, and that there's something about, because this is part of a chapter which calls into question the possibility of rational explanations of the whale. Right? Ahab is trying to predict where the whale is going to show up using these charts and using the sea lore and the experiences of others. And one of the things we might say is that maybe what this dramatizes is the way in which the whale, if it represents something, represents what isn't representable, or what is somehow beyond our ability to rationalize it, or just beyond the limits of our fancy and imagination. And therefore it resists description, and therefore this ultimately is going to be a failure, this attempt to describe it. And if that's true, we might want to think about this, the form of this whole book. Maybe it also is doomed to be a failure. Maybe it has set itself an impossible project, was the project of describing something that's not describable, representing something that in the end is unrepresentable. And then the last thing I told you last time, that the modern Prometheus, right? So Prometheus, the Prometheus myth, if you're not Rick Riordan, anybody read Rick Riordan? Percy Jackson? No Percy Jackson readers. Guess you're too old for that now. I have a younger son, so read all these things. Movie, unfortunately, not as good. Prometheus shows up as a kind of dappered suit guy who's not exactly on mankind's side. But the idea is that Prometheus gave civilization to humankind. He gives humankind fire, right, which allows, despite what the gods want. So he allows civilization basically to begin in one dominant version of the myth. For that, he's punished. Remember? He gets chained to a rock. Vulture comes, or an eagle comes, I think it eats his liver every day. But every night it grows back, and vulture comes again. I think he's finally freed by Percy or something like that. In any case, you might say, Shelley's rewriting of the Prometheus myth is a lot darker. Right? What she looks at in the Prometheus myth is the defiance of the natural order of things. And the modern Prometheus is somebody who would either usurp the privilege of the gods or usurp the privilege of Prometheus, in any case, attempt to meddle where one shouldn't. Giving life, giving civilization belongs to something other than humankind. So if we usurp that, very bad things happen. And what we have is this kind of weird, it's unbidden birth. And unfathered, I think, in the sense that the reason it would be unfathered, let me see if I can find the exact... creature in the he who makes him okay. The idea of God the Father not being involved in this, I think, is part of what Melville is getting at here, right? So I want us to understand that one of the things that's at stake for Ahab, and therefore for Ishmael, insofar as he's become part of this oath, is, in some sense, a kind of questioning of the order of things that has begun with the Enlightenment. Right? Remember, the Enlightenment itself is about making the central drama of the West not the relationship between God and humankind, but human consciousness itself. Right? After Descartes, we start to become interested in consciousness. It's an anthropocentric, human-centered vision of the world. Isn't this just an extension of that mode of thinking? I mean, Nietzsche's insight later on in the century will be that God is dead. And what he's dramatizing there is moments like this, where we start to question the nature of humankind's relationship to God, and even, the importance of God at all. Right? So that's kind of what's at stake here. Okay, that's one thing I want us to think about. Let's get to that other question I asked you about last time. What color is the white whale really? And how do you know? Anybody? Things growing on him? You mean like barnacles?
Yes.
It's possible. Can you find it for me? It is in Moby Dick. And just so that we're clear, it's in Moby Dick the chapter, which refers to Moby Dick the character, which means there's no hyphen. When we refer to Moby Dick the novel, we need the hyphen. Mistake not this on your exam. Automatic point deduction. Every time you do it. What color is the white whale really? Yeah. Transparent? You're going to have to give me textual evidence for this, so you better have a place to show.
Textual, but if it's an albino whale.
Isn't it a what?
Albino whale?
Yeah, it's referred to as the albino whale.
If it were an albino whale, its skin does not produce pigment, so technically it's not any color.
Well, then it would be white. Yes, it would be white.
But that's just the reflection of the sunlight to us. It was what actually is present.
Which he talks about in the Whiteness of the Whale, right? I mean, it's that all color, no color sort of thing. So you're telling me the whale is a white whale. It's albino. And therefore, it's either all colors or no colors. I mean, obviously, when you see pictures of the white whale in pictures, it's often white. Of course, Ishmael himself has a whole chapter about monstrous and erroneous pictures of whales. So we sure about that? We're willing to stipulate. We're willing to stake our grades in the course on the idea that this is a white whale. Any other thoughts? Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's not like solid white, like it says it's streaked and spotted, and kind of describes it as marble a couple times.
Very good. Show me where.
Page 155.
Okay, read it, please.
The rest of his body was so streaked and spotted and marble with the same shrouded hue that in the end it became his distinctive appellation of the white whale.
Okay. A name indeed literally justified, this is the middle of 155, by his vivid aspect when seen gliding at high noon through a dark blue sea, leaving a Milky Way wake of creamy foam all spangled with golden gleamings. So, he's not an all-white whale. He is not a fully albino whale. In fact, he's not all that different, it turns out, from most sperm whales. I'll show you a picture next time. Most sperm whales have white at places around their forehead, certainly around their mouth. Oceanographers and ocean zoologists think that, in fact, this may have something to do with being able to serve as lures when they sound and go into the depths of the dark water. Fishes that they're trying to attract and other things might see them. They don't really know. But all whales have a little bit of white on them. Turns out that this one has a lot more white. But it isn't completely white. And I actually think this is one of Melville's telling details. Let's go look up further on the page. And thank you for noticing that. Even stripped of these supernatural surmisings, there was enough in the earthly make and incontestable character of the monster to strike the imagination with unwonted power. For it was not so much his uncommon bulk that so much distinguished him from other sperm whales, but, as was elsewhere thrown out, a peculiar snow-white wrinkled forehead and a high, pyramidical white hump. These were his prominent features, the tokens whereby even in the limitless, uncharted seas, he revealed his identity at a long distance to those who knew him. But the rest of his body was so streaked and spotted and marbled with this same shrouded hue. So the rest of his body is streaked and shrouded with this hue, which is whiteness, that in the end he gained his distinct appellation of the white whale. So he's a white whale who's actually a black and white whale, right? Most sperm whales have a black body. He too mostly has a black body, but it's streaked and shrouded with this hue. And then he has a white hump on the top, right? And he has a white hump and this white wrinkled forehead. And when does he seem most fully white? What does it say? When is he most fully white? When he's in the dark sea. A name indeed literally justified, so previously not literally justified, but a name then literally justified by his vivid aspect when seen gliding at high noon, so in the light, through a dark blue sea. He becomes whiter the darker the background around him, the context around him. I want you to think about that for a moment. Melville is writing about, you might say, a white whale. Here, Ishmael is describing the construction of that whiteness. He's taken to be white by those who see him or have heard of him because of the way he looks in the water when he is surrounded by black, and because there's so much white on him, more white than on other whales. Nevertheless, he's a black and white whale. Think of the context of 1850. I'd suggest to you it is not possible to be writing about blackness and whiteness and not have this somewhere in your imagination, consciously or unconsciously. This is part of the imagination of this text, right? The Compromise of 1850, the Fugitive Slave Law, the fact that Melville's father-in-law, the Chief Justice of Massachusetts, returned the first fugitive slave. The text is marked by these, you might say, culturally traumatic events. And I think at the heart of the text, this white whale, it is no accident that it is not just an albino whale, or that albino is a kind of shorthand for the actual dynamics of what's going on here. That it's a white whale that seems white because it's more white than other whales, and that because surrounded by blackness, it comes to seem as if it's only white. So there's something about the darkness of the context around it that highlights the whiteness. I mean, this is an argument that some scholars, and maybe most prominently the Nobel Prize-winning author Toni Morrison, makes about all of American literature. And she draws on Melville's novel as an example of a text that's kind of trying to resist this logic. And the logic is that at the deep heart of American literature lies a guilty conscience about the subject of and the fact of blackness. Her analysis probably could be extended by thinking, as we would know in our course, back to Native Americans. But we might take her point. There have always been dark others. And she wants to say that just as the Enlightenment, which she calls the age of scientific racism, constructs itself against a background of domination, so too does the American liberal self construct itself around a background of domination and, in particular, racism and slavery. That whiteness as a concept is constructed around its difference from blackness, and in American historical terms, in the fact that there's a huge black population living amidst whiteness. And she says that this is true of American literature even when it isn't apparently true of American literature. That when you look at it, there is this kind of awareness of this dark, what she calls this dark abiding presence at the heart of almost every American literary text. For her, and she has a very interesting analysis of Ahab, which probably pushes it too far, but she says, of course Ahab is crazy. Because one of the things that he's doing in resisting the white whale is resisting precisely this ideology of whiteness. The part of what's going on is that he is setting himself at odds with the most basic assumption of his society. How could he be anything other than crazy if that's the case? All right, I want you to think about this, right? Think about the sense, and one of the things that we've been trying to develop here is a sense of a context of American literary text. And I want to suggest to you that one of the ways in which Moby Dick is, in fact, a national novel in the middle of the 19th century is because many of these cultural contradictions, conflicts, and energies have worked their way into their text. I think Melville is quite conscious, probably, about this. I mean, I suggested to you that other evidence that he knows his father-in-law's case as well comes from his use of the term monomania, which actually was in a case that Shaw presided over. I think it was called Commonwealth versus Rogers, about 6 years earlier, in which Shaw ruled that the Massachusetts state prison inmate named Rogers, who claimed that voices had told him that the warden would kill him, was not guilty by reason of insanity, specifically the insanity of monomania. Shaw wrote this: "The act was the result of the disease and not of a mind capable of choosing. It was the result of uncontrollable impulse and not of a person acted upon by motives and governed by the will." So that idea of monomania is something that Melville is playing with. But you might say he's a little bit critical of that idea of monomania, or he develops it in a more detailed and dramatic way. Ahab calls himself in his soliloquy, the Sunset chapter, I am madness maddened, right? I mean, what does it mean to be madness maddened? It's precisely the kind of madness that comes to interest Poe. The madness that is in some sense just this side of rational, that is able to use rationality as its instrument and appear in many instances to be absolutely rational. Ahab, as you might say, teetering between these things. In a certain way, it's the Hamlet problem. Is Hamlet mad or not? Is Hamlet play acting or not? Is he play acting sometimes and not play acting at other times? And how do you know? The same thing might be true of Ahab. Is he mad or is he not? Is he completely rational? So a couple of things I want to show you. I want to go to towards the end of the sections that we've read today and look at a chapter that's called Fast Fish and Loosed Fish, just so you understand a little bit more about these dynamics of freedom and unfreedom and the novel's engagement with what we might call the culture around it. So this is chapter 89, and it starts on page 307. Does anybody remember it? What's the difference between a fast fish and a loose fish? Yeah.
The fast fish is something where there's already a line attached to it, and it belongs to whoever has the line.
Okay.
Loose fish is a fish
Loose fish is a fish
that's up for grabs.
that's up for grabs. Thank you. That's right. And there's a little refinement to be made about that. Having a line attached to it means you're actually holding that line.
I think so.
No, actually, what it means is that you could be holding the line. In other words, you attach something to mark it as your possession. So if you're fast to it, you start out by hooking your harpoon and holding it. But then at a certain point, you can let go as long as you can attach a waif to it. Right? So you hook something else instead of you that acts as your agent, you might say, right? And the only stipulation is you cannot go so far away that you can't actually go and retrieve it in a timely fashion. So let's take a look at that on page. Thank you very much. That's right. Take a look at page 308. He's trying to talk about the code of the sea. He's developing this. He's talking about these ideas. 1, a fast fish belongs to the party fast to it. 2, a loose fish is fair game for anyone who can soonest catch it, right? Up for grabs. But what plays the mischief with this masterly code is the admirable brevity of it, which necessitates a vast volume of commentaries to expound it. First, what is a fast fish? Alive or dead, a fish is technically fast when it is connected with an occupied ship or boat by any medium at all controllable by the occupant or occupants, a mast, an oar, a 9-inch cable, a telegraph wire, or a strand of cobweb. It is all the same. Likewise, a fish is technically fast when it bears a waif or any other recognized symbol of possession, so long as the party waifing it plainly evince their ability at any time to take it alongside as well as their intention to do so. Right? So one of the things we've noticed here is that all the questions that we've been talking about having to do with agency, the ability to act, the ability to have intentions, are part of whale hunting. They're part of the fabric of whale hunting. So let's talk a little bit more about this. A fast fish, we get that. What is a loose fish again? You said it well. Say it again.
It's a fish that is up for grabs.
Okay, a loose fish is a fish that's up for grabs. If we think from the standpoint of the whale for a moment, let's do the thought experiment. What's wrong with that way of thinking about things? A fast fish is a fish that's caught. A loose fish is a fish that's up for grabs. What's wrong with that if I'm the whale? What's that? The whale, very good. The whale isn't just conceived of as free. It's not a loose fish is a free whale. In some sense, it suggests there's no such thing as a free whale. There's only a fast fish and a fish that's waiting to become a fast fish, the so-called loose fish, because it's up for grabs. Now, I think that's an important distinction, and I think it's a distinction that Ishmael is making for us. It's the same idea that I've been talking about before with the negative conception of liberty. Freedom is parasitic on the idea of unfreedom. We can't define freedom without the idea of unfreedom. That's a little weird when you think about it. Likewise, this loose fish and fast fish business. There's no such thing as a free fish. There's only this conception of whales. This conception in which they are either caught or waiting to be caught. Either way, they're dominated by humankind. All right, that's interesting enough as far as it goes, but I want you to see what Ishmael does with it later on. right? Because he has this kind of Thoreauvian impulse, you might say, to start off with something that looks material, but then to render it abstract, and then abstracter, right? As more abstract as he possibly can, and more generally applicable. Take a look at the bottom of 309. Is it not a saying in everyone's mouth, possession is half the law? That is, regardless of how the thing came into possession. But often possession is the whole of the law. What are the sinews and souls of Russian serfs and Republican slaves but fast fish, whereof possession is the whole of the law, right? So now he's going to generalize on. Serfs in Russia, slaves that we own, right? That context. They're fast fish. Possession is the whole of the law, right? Remember Frederick Douglass. What right had his master to take any of his earnings? The right of the grim-visaged pirate. That's the right he had. What Irving calls in the History of New York the right by gunpowder. What to the rapacious landlord is the widow's last mite but a fast fish? What is yonder undetected villain's marble mansion with a door plate for a waif? What is that by a fast fish? What is the ruinous discount which Mordecai the broker gets from poor Woebegone the bankrupt on loan to keep Woebegone's family from starvation? What is that ruinous discount but a fast fish? It's yours because you have the force to take it. And yeah, it's anti-Semitic, but this is a 19th century text. What is the Archbishop of Sayshol's income of £100,000? It's also anti-Christian, so equal opportunity. Saved from the scant bread and cheese of hundreds of thousands of broken-backed laborers, all sure of heaven without any of Sayshol's help. What is that globular 100,000 but a fast fish? What are the Duke of Dunder's hereditary towns and hamlets but fast fish? What to that redoubted harpooner John Bull? We know what John Bull is, right? It's a characterization of England. John Bull, but Ireland, is poor Ireland but a fast fish. What to that apostolic lancer, brother Jonathan, the United States? Is Texas, recently annexed, but a fast fish? And concerning all these, is not possession the whole of the law? All right. But, he says, if that's true of the fast fish, think about the loose fish, everything else, and think how even more broadly applicable that is. Internationally, he says, and universally applicable. What was America in 1492 but a loose fish in which Columbus struck the Spanish standard by way of waifing it for his royal master and mistress? What was Poland to the Tsar, Greece to the Turk, India to England? What at last will Mexico be to the United States? All loose fish, right? I mean, in the middle of the 19th century, it sure as hell looked as if the United States, driven by this ideology of manifest destiny, was destined in some sense to take over the entire continent. We can say it didn't happen yet. What are the right? Okay, so that's the cultural situation, the historical situation. So I'm telling you, the novel and Ishmael have these things on their mind, right? Slavery, the Mexican War. It's all there. It's in the imagination of the text. What are the rights of man? Still more abstract. What are the rights of man and the liberties of the world but loose fish? What does that mean? The rights of man and liberties are up for grabs? Well, maybe it relates back to what I've been saying, that there is no real conception of freedom. Freedom is always ringed by constraint. What are all men's minds and opinions? But loose fish. Maybe we are also ringed by constraint in ways we don't see, waiting to be caught. What is the principle of religious belief in them but a loose fish? Religion able to be manipulated, as Stowe and Peleg and Bildad and Ishmael all show us. What to the ostentatious, smuggling verbalist? Now, who might they be? Emerson, maybe? Melville? Hawthorne? Ostentatious, smuggling verbalists, but a loose fish. And here's the kicker. And what are you, reader, but a loose fish and a fast fish, too? What does that mean? How could you be a loose fish and a fast fish? Were you loose? I mean, being loose apparently is not that good. And now it turns out you're fast as well. What's in you, reader? What has its tenterhooks in you already? At page 310 and chapter 89 of the novel. Don't say me. I wasn't there when Ishmael wrote this down. All right, I want you to bear that in mind, right? I mean, I think these are questions that have to do with, you might say, the cultural imagination of the book, but they also have to do with interpretation and your freedom to interpret, right? So they are ultimately questions about reading as well. And what I want you to see is these kinds of questions that seem like they're separate kinds of questions. Questions about reading and interpretation and audience on the one hand, questions about agency and domination on the other, are entwined in this book. And maybe the book's just dramatizing the fact that they're always entwined for us. All right, video break. I am going to show you what an actual Nantucket sleigh ride looks like. This is from a 1922 movie. It's a brief clip called Down to the Sea in Ships. The Nantucket sleigh ride is what the name given to what happens when you throw a harpoon in a whale and then it takes off. Right? You remember that chapter that's called The Line. If you have this edition of the book, there's actually a picture of what the line looks like. It's on page 451. And one of the things that Ishmael then goes on to do in this chapter called The Line is to describe it quite vividly, how this line works. They're all sitting there in this little boat, but you need to have feet and feet and feet and feet of line so that once the thing is caught in the whale, you can let it run out. You can't be right there. You have to give it a lot of room to run itself out. It'll tow you along eventually. Right? Because we understand how this works, this whale hunting. Right? We understand? They shoot a harpoon. They launch a harpoon into the whale, and then they hang on for dear life. And they let the whale run itself, pissed off, the whale now, try to get the thing out of it and swim itself into exhaustion. And then when the whale is really, really tired, and this might take hours, and it might go for miles and miles away from the ship itself. When it's really tired, they pull themselves up alongside, they take another harpoon and stab it in the heart. Sometimes through the eye. Stab it till it's dead, through the blowhole, till it's dead. And then they take it back. They tow it back, or the ship comes and finds them, depending on how they take it back. They stick it on the side of the ship, and they start to peel it, skin off, to get at the blubber, the fat that's underneath. These are what's described in all of these chapters. So, I'm going to show you, this is a movie that was made almost at the very end of the age of whaling. I mean, as I'll talk about it a little more next time. Melville writes this in 1850-51, which is the high point of whaling. By 54, the whaling industry has already started to go in decline, in part because of the discovery of some oil in New England, in part because of the gold rush. And there are, quite literally in that later period, there are sailors that go out 3 years of whaling. They bring back full holds, and they find that the price of whale oil has plummeted, and they can't sell the stuff, or not sell it to make their oil worthwhile. So this is an industry that is very short-lived in a certain way, and Melville has captured it. He's captured something that's almost, we would say, already gone at the time that he's writing about it. And so in 1922, this is a movie that is, well, it's a weird kind of Orientalist marriage comedy set around whaling. And it also has some kind of documentary footage, right? So there's that. And then I will show you a little, right after, a bit of actual footage of the bailing the case and the processing of the whale that goes on. That's from the 1930 adaptation of Moby Dick. I'm actually going to, so you can see better, I'm going to turn on the lights. And we'll see if we need to manipulate them at the end again later. But you'll be able to see the line in there. Got the sound back? Okay. I want to actually take a quick look at that chapter that's called The Line. This is starts on page 227. And I want to look at the end of the chapter, right? He's described this stuff, and you can see how it works, right? Okay. But he's described it in a way that seems like it's just another one of these chapters about whaling that's kind of boring, and we should skip it. And they certainly do leave it out of the abridgment that's called Moby Dick, the good parts. Of course, to me, these are the good parts. And part of it is, I think that one of the things is you avoid these things at your peril because they're the moments when Ishmael actually gets to the heart of what the novel is really about. It's what makes the novel not just an adventure story about killing whales. So look at the bottom of 229. Or let's do the middle. Perhaps a very little thought will now enable you to account for those repeated whaling disasters, some few of which are casually chronicled, of this man or that man being taken out of the boat by the line and lost. I want you to remember these dynamics. They become important. For when the line is darting out, to be seated then in the boat is like being seated in the midst of the manifold whizzings of a steam engine in full play. When every flying beam and shaft and wheel is grazing you, it is worse. For you cannot sit motionless in the heart of these perils, because the boat is rocking like a cradle, and you are pitched one way and the other without the slightest warning, and only by a certain self-adjusting buoyancy and simultaneousness of volition and action can you escape being made a Mazeppa of and run away with where the all-seeing sun himself could never pierce you out. Remember that description over the weekend. Okay. Again, as the profound calm which only apparently precedes and prophesies of the storm is perhaps more awful than the storm itself. For indeed the calm is but the wrapper and the envelope of the storm, and contains it in itself, as the seemingly harmless rifle holds the fatal power and the ball and the explosion. Right? So this is a meditation on anticipation and also potential, and the hidden things inside of other things that may well kill you. So the graceful repose of the line, as it silently serpentines about the oarsman before being brought into actual play, this is a thing which carries more of the true terror than any other aspect of this dangerous affair. And now you should think, I think, of Jonathan Edwards in that moment of the spider, right? Remember that. He says, there's no reason that you haven't dropped into hell right now, but that God just doesn't will it at this particular moment. All men live enveloped in whale lines. All are born with halters around their necks. But it is only when caught in the swift, sudden turn of death that mortals realize the silent, subtle, ever-present perils of life. And if you be a philosopher, though seated in the whaleboat, you would not at heart feel one whit more of terror than those seated before your evening fire with a poker and not a harpoon by your side. He's saying this should not scare you any more than simply being seated right there with your pen by your side instead of this harpoon. Or the other way to think about it is that you should be just as afraid sitting there where you are as you would be over there. What do you think about that? Is it true? If it were true, on what assumptions does it depend? If it's not his time to go, then he's not going, right? So he doesn't have to worry about it. As Stubb would say, hey, it's all predestinated. Don't have to worry about it. If it's my time, it's my time. Nothing I'm going to do is going to change it, right? If somebody is sitting right in this room and suddenly it's their time, they'll have a seizure or they'll be ejected into space or the ground will open up before it'll be their time, right? Not likely to happen, but who knows? Do we believe it? Or is this, what is this? Is this a weird kind of rationalizing? Should we be suspicious of this logic here? Is it not the case that if you put yourself here, you're actually more likely to have something terrible happen to you than if you just don't and you sit around and just have a day job and something that's on land and it's easy and you stay out of harm's way and don't run in the road and all that kind of stuff? Yeah.
Well, if there's something that, because you'd be a philosopher, so if there's something at stake in life besides life and death,
Yeah, I guess that's right. If there's something at stake, one of the things but it does seem to, if you be a philosopher, I mean, that's kind of like the casual locution, well, thinking philosophically or, you got to be philosophical about this. What does that actually mean? Let's be philosophical about this. I mean, we know, even if we haven't taken philosophy courses, that there's a bunch of courses in the philosophy department, and there's lots of different kinds of philosophy, and they often are at odds with one another. So what is being philosophical? For what is that shorthand? And should we be suspicious of it? Is it not like, there's a certain pattern of logic that's emerging here. Better sleep with a sober cannibal than a drunken Christian, right? Better to be with, Ahab and somebody who doesn't know what he's doing. Yeah.
Couldn't his reference to the line also be referring to the Mason-Dixon line?
It's possible.
So, like, the attempt to maintain the Union would be dragging you into the...
I think it's possible. I don't know that in the moment that Melville is writing, just referring to the line is necessarily, in the way that I'm suggesting to you, that referring to black and white is going to be charged. I'm not sure referring to the line is going to be as charged. But you know what? That would be a great topic, well, not for this paper, but for a paper. It would be an interesting thing to think about. I mean, if you were going to make that, and we could say, sure, among the possibilities of the things that might be mine, given all the other possibilities, it could be a reference to that, and therefore, again, another reference to the division of the country and the problem of slavery. And but what evidence would you really want to be able to marshal from the text in order to be persuasive about that? It's a suggestive thing. I can't say, yeah, sure. But I don't know that I actually believe it, but I'm willing to be convinced. Yeah.
Well, this is the idea of you're putting yourself in that boat or having a day job and you're trying to figure out whether you might die in that situation. Doesn't that kind of go back to the Puritan idea of like salvation and comfort? It's fully arbitrary. You don't know what you've been doing.
But it isn't arbitrary. It's only arbitrary maybe from your point of view. From God's point of view, it's fully intentional. That's what providence is. But you don't know. So you have faith. So one of the things that Ishmael is saying, that to do that, you need to have a little faith. What happens when, like Ahab, you lose that faith? What can you substitute for that faith? He seems to be substituting his own revenge, maybe, or his own force of personality. I don't know. We're only halfway through. We'll have to see how it turns out. But it's kind of, there's certain, what does it mean to get yourself to go whaling? What do you need to believe? And are you fooling yourself in believing it?
You have to believe in anything? I mean, can you just go?
You could go, I guess. And maybe you don't really care if what you're trying to do is commit suicide by other means. Remember, right? Cato, falls on his sword. Other people take ball and pistol. I go to sea. I go a whaling. Is this suicide by other means? Then you don't care. It's like, get it over with, please. I don't have to work so hard. Yeah.
Well, I think another point that he's trying to make here is that by being put in kind of this mortal danger, you're more aware of life versus, I think it's more an argument about like awareness of the human condition more than anything else, not necessarily like the fear.
I like that idea, although I'm not. Where do you see that in this passage? The idea that somehow being in this position makes you more alive than.
Well, I mean, when he says here, all are born with halters around their neck,
Mhm.
it's only when caught in swift sudden turn of death that mortals realize the silent, subtle, ever-present perils of life.
Right. Yeah, I can see that's right. But the implication of that to me is that only when you're about to die do you suddenly realize how, I don't know, everybody's like how short life was.
Or just that you were alive to begin with.
Yeah, you realize, I don't know. I think there are other passages where I would go to say that there's something about this that creates a certain kind of intensity of experience and imagination. But it's not incompatible with it. Yeah, Lou?
It seems like you might be saying quite the opposite, in that all are born, etc., and then only some of death that mortals realize the silent, subtle, ever-present perils of life. Meaning, you'd think, oh my God, if you're on, if you're sitting in your study, you'd think, wow, if I was on a whaling ship right now, being pulled by a whale, would be extremely dangerous. But it's actually not that crazy. So you realize that the everyday, the ever-present perils of life are just as equal.
Yeah.
As the ones on the ship.
No, I think that's right. That's what he's trying to suggest, is that you're sitting there, you think you're comfortable, you're not in peril, but you are.
But also, you think when you're on the ship, you're just crazy peril, but it's not that crazy.
That's the other thing he's saying. He's saying both of those things, that there's the same, but what I'm trying to say is they're underwritten by a system of belief, and that system of belief is when it's your time, it's your time. What if you don't believe in that system of belief then? Or do you have to? And does he? Does he really? I mean, how are we going to finally decide what he believes about predestination? Does he really believe it in fatedness? Or he makes all these jokes about it. Is he serious here and not serious elsewhere? Is he always serious? Yeah.
I feel like that if you be a philosopher thing also has a kind of ring, like if you feel like it, like if you want to see it this way, you can. I don't know.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think it also, wouldn't you say that there's an implication that, here's one way to look at it is true, but also it's something that most people don't, right? Because if you're a philosopher, you would understand it in this slightly deeper way. If you be a philosopher, though seated in the whaleboat, you would not at heart feel one more whit more of terror, right? Why? Because you understand the way it really is. And the way it really is that life itself is dangerous. We're always born with a noose around our necks, or we have one foot in the grave, we're slipping down towards death. Being philosophical about it means a certain kind of acceptance of this. And when it's our time to, it doesn't even mean, I suppose you could argue it doesn't even mean that. You have to say that you have to believe in predestination of any kind, except for the predestination of death. We're all dead. We're just waiting to get there. When it comes, it comes. I don't know. All right, I'm going to show you one other clip. This is what happens after they do this. So this is cutting in and trying out. This is about 45 seconds long. Yum, yum. There we go. What I want to suggest is that what Ahab doing something different, right? Or is it in some sense just an extension of what it is that whaling is always about, right? Insofar as he's choosing one whale to pick out, that's a little strange. But insofar as he's suggesting that the mission of the Pequod is going to be the reassertion of humankind's domination over nature, isn't that what whalers always do? Isn't that part of what's at stake? The domination of nature, the transformation of natural creatures into human products, dead human products. And part of what we see in a chapter like Stubbs Suffer is the extent to which, in this moment, the products of the whale are everywhere, right? They come to surround us even in a way that we start to take for granted. So one of the things I want to suggest to you is that built into the whole business of whaling, to have a little, 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 faith, doing, faith, 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 doing, doing, to have a little, 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 to have a little,